The August sun hung low over Stillwater Creek when they lowered Gunnar Halverson into Montana soil. 6 men carried the pine coffin across ground so dry it cracked beneath their boots. Sigrid stood at the graveside in her black wool dress, the fabric too heavy for summer sweat tracing lines down her temples that she refused to wipe away. 41 years old. No children. A cabin with a leaking roof and a woodpile that wouldn't last past February. The preacher read from Psalms, something about green pastures and still waters. Words that meant nothing in a territory where the pastures turned brown by July and the creeks froze solid enough to walk a horse across by December. Sigrid watched them shovel dirt onto the coffin lid and thought about the sound a cottonwood log makes when it crushes a man's chest. She'd heard it from 100 yards away. A sound like a branch breaking, except the branch was her husband's ribs, and the sap that ran out was his blood pooling in the sawdust. 3 months married. 37 years together. And now she stood alone while the neighbors gathered in small clusters, speaking in voices they thought she couldn't hear. What will she do now? Sell the place, most likely. Has to. Woman her age can't work a homestead alone. Maybe her people back in Minnesota will take her in. She has people back east. Somebody said a sister or cousin. Something like that. Sigrid listened to them discuss her future as though she were a problem to be solved. A complication in the orderly business of frontier life. A widow at 41 with no children, and 160 acres of land that required the strength of 2 people to maintain. The mathematics were simple. The solution was obvious. Sell the homestead. Move back to civilization. Find some relative willing to house a woman who'd outlived her usefulness. The funeral gathering at her cabin afterwards felt like a wake for 2 deaths. Her husband in the ground and her future in the grave beside him. Women brought food she wouldn't eat. Men stood in corners discussing the value of her property in voices just loud enough for her to catch the numbers. $1,600 if the right buyer came along. Maybe $1,200 if she needed to sell quick before winter. Josiah Kincaid approached her with his hat in his hands, his face arranged in an expression of practiced sympathy. He was 53 years old, had homesteaded his 160 acres 7 years earlier, and considered himself the unofficial authority on survival in the Stillwater Creek Valley. He'd built 3 cabins in his time here. He'd buried a wife and a son. He knew what the territory demanded and what it forgave, and he knew that a 41-year-old Swedish widow fell into neither category. Mrs. Halverson, he said. Terrible loss. Gunnar was a good man. He was. If there's anything you need, anything at all. She looked at him at the calculations running behind his sympathetic eyes. Kincaid owned the adjacent property. Her land would round out his holdings nicely, give him control of nearly half a mile of creek frontage. Thank you, Mr. Kincaid. I'll remember that. He lingered, waiting for her to say more, to announce her intentions, to ask his advice about buyers or prices, or the best time to list a property before the snow made travel difficult. When she said nothing else, he nodded awkwardly and moved away to join the other men. Captain Nathaniel Rourke came next. Rourke was 48, a former Union Army officer who'd spent a winter at Fort Laramie and had the frostbite scars on 2 fingers to prove it. He didn't traffic in false comfort or empty pleasantries. You have enough wood split for winter, he asked. Not a condolence. A practical question. No, didn't think so. I'll send my boy over next week to help you cut. That's kind of you. It's not kindness, Mrs. Halverson. It's arithmetic. Dead neighbors make the territory look bad when they're trying to attract more settlers. Government doesn't like that. He moved on before she could respond, and Sigrid found herself appreciating his honesty more than all the warm words and soft looks from the others. At least Rourke treated her like someone capable of understanding her own situation. The others looked at her like she was already dead, just hadn't realized it yet. The last guest left as the sun touched the western ridge. Sigrid stood in the doorway of her cabin and watched them go, their wagons raising dust on the trail, their horses eager for home, and oats and water that didn't have to be hauled from a creek. When the final wagon disappeared around the bend, she went inside and sat at the table Gunnar had built their first winter here. Pine boards, rough-hewn but solid. He'd been proud of that table, proud of the cabin he'd raised with his own hands, proud of the life they'd carved out of wilderness. She ran her fingers over the wood grain and remembered. The memory came unbidden. Uppsala, Sweden. Winter of 1849. She was 13 years old, and the cold that year had killed cattle standing in their barns. Her grandfather, Frederick, sat beside the great tile stove that dominated the main room of their farmhouse, his hands wrapped around a cup of weak beer, his eyes reflecting the glow of flames that had burned down to coals hours ago. Feel the floor, Sigrid. Put your hand on the stones. She'd pressed her palm against the floor near the stove's base, expecting cold. Instead, warmth radiated up through the stone, gentle and constant, like the earth itself was heated. The fire died hours ago, she said. How is it still warm? Her grandfather smiled. His face was weathered from 70 winters, his hands gnarled from 70 years of farm work. But his mind remained sharp as a new blade. Kakaluggen, he said. The tile stove. But the secret isn't the tile's child. The secret is what lies beneath. He explained it then in the simple terms a 13-year-old could understand. The massive stone foundation that absorbed heat when the fire burned hot. The channels that carried warm air through the masonry before it escaped up the chimney. The principle that had kept Swedish farmhouses warm for generations while using half the wood their neighbors burned. Stone remembers heat, he said. Air forgets it instantly. Everything your grandmother and I do, everything about how this house is built is designed around that one truth. Make the stone remember, and it will keep you warm long after the fire sleeps. Sigrid hadn't thought about that conversation in years. Decades, even. There'd been no need. Minnesota, where she and Gunnar had first settled, had communities, towns, neighbors close enough to help. The brutal isolation of Montana territory, the absolute dependence on your own resources had seemed like an adventure when they arrived 5 years ago. Now it felt like a death sentence. She looked around the cabin Gunnar had built. Single room 16 by 20 feet. A stone fireplace on the north wall that drew well and threw good heat when the fire was burning. But the moment the flames died down, the warmth fled up the chimney and out through the gaps in the log walls. Winter nights meant stoking the fire every 2 hours, meant waking from exhausted sleep to feed the flames before the water bucket froze, meant burning through wood at a rate that required cutting and splitting all summer, just to stay alive through January. Gunnar had done most of that work. Strong as a draft horse, even at 67, He'd spent the summer months building their woodpile while Sigrid tended the garden and preserved food. Division of labor that made sense when there were two of them. But now there was one. She could sell. Take whatever Kincaid offered knowing it would be 20% less than the land was worth, and ride back to Minnesota before the first snow. Find that distant cousin in St. Paul. Accept charity from people who barely remembered her name. Or she could stay. Burn through the inadequate woodpile by February. Freeze to death in March like so many other stubborn homesteaders who thought willpower could substitute for firewood. Or Sigrid stood and walked to the window. The sun had set now, and the August darkness was soft, nothing like the brutal black of winter nights. Through the glass, she could see the outline of her chimney rising 14 feet above the roofline. Standard construction, same as every other settler's chimney along Stillwater Creek. A straight stone column that carried smoke and heat up and out, warming the sky while the cabin grew cold. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. Stone remembers heat. Air forgets it instantly. She thought about the massive foundation beneath the Uppsala farmhouse, about the channels that captured escaping warmth and stored it in rock that released it slowly through the longest nights, about a principle so old the Romans had used it 2,000 years before her grandfather was born. The neighbors expected her to sell. They'd already calculated the value of her failure, divided up her property in their minds, written her off as another casualty of frontier life. Let them. The next morning, Sigrid saddled her mare and rode to the Crow encampment 3 miles east. The Crow had lived in this valley for generations before any white settler arrived. They understood the land in ways the homesteaders were still learning. And they traded labor for goods without the complicated social expectations that came with asking neighbors for help. She found 2 hawks and his brother Gray Owl mending fishing nets near the creek. 2 hawks was perhaps 30 with steady hands and eyes that missed nothing. His English was better than most settlers' Swedish. "I need men to dig," Sigrid said. "Hard work. 3 weeks, maybe 4. I pay in flour, salt, and tobacco. Fair wait." 2 hawks set down his net. "What are you digging?" "A hole beneath my cabin floor. Deep. 7 feet at least." He exchanged a glance with his brother. Gray Owl said something in Crow that Sigrid didn't understand, but 2 hawks shook his head. "The ground will freeze soon," he said. "Digging will be difficult. That's why I need to start now." He studied her for a long moment. Most settlers' widows would be packing their belongings, not planning excavation projects. But 2 hawks had learned not to judge white people by normal standards. They did strange things for reasons they rarely explained. "We will come tomorrow," he said. "Show us where you want the hole." Sigrid nodded and turned her horse toward home. Behind her, she heard Gray Owl ask another question in Crow. 2 hawks' response was brief, and though she couldn't understand the words, she caught the tone. Curiosity, and perhaps a sliver of respect. They began digging on the 1st of September, and by the end of the first week, the entire Stillwater Creek settlement knew about the Swedish widow's madness. Sigrid had removed a section of her cabin floor, exposing the packed earth beneath. 2 hawks and Gray Owl worked from dawn to dusk, breaking through soil that grew harder with each foot of depth, hauling out wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow of dirt that Sigrid used to build up a windbreak on the cabin's north side. The neighbors came to watch. They didn't help, didn't offer advice, just stood at a distance and observed the spectacle of a woman digging her own grave, as Josiah Kincaid put it, to anyone who'd listen. "That Swedish woman has lost her mind," Kincaid declared at the general store in town. 3 weeks digging a hole while her woodpile sits half empty. She's going to freeze to death playing in the mud while winter laughs at her. His words traveled back to Sigrid through the efficient gossip network of frontier life. She heard them and kept digging. By mid-September, the hole was 8 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 4 feet deep. 2 hawks had stopped asking questions about the purpose. He simply dug where Sigrid indicated, following the marks she'd made in the earth with flour and string. "Deep," she told him. 7 feet, maybe more. "The water table," he said. "We may hit water at 6 feet. Then we line it with stone to keep the water out." He nodded slowly. "You're building something." "Yes. Something to do with heat." She looked at him sharply. "How did you know?" 2 hawks leaned on his shovel. "My grandmother's grandmother told stories about the long winters before the horse came. The old ones built fire pits underground, lined them with river stones, cooked their food on hot rocks, slept on earth that held the warmth." Sigrid felt a chill that had nothing to do with the September wind. Different peoples, different continents, different centuries, all discovering the same truth. "Stone remembers heat," she said. 2 hawks smiled. "And air forgets it." Yes, word of the digging had spread beyond Stillwater Creek by the time October arrived. Travelers passing through mentioned the Swedish widow to settlers in neighboring valleys. The story grew with each telling. She was digging for buried gold. She was building a root cellar big enough to live in. She was excavating a grave for her late husband because she didn't trust the cemetery soil. The truth, Sigrid knew, was stranger than any of the rumors. By the first week of October, the excavation was complete. 7 feet deep, 12 feet long, 8 feet wide. A rectangular pit beneath her cabin floor that had taken 6 weeks of back-breaking labor to create. Now came the harder part. She'd been hauling river stones since August, using Gunner's wagon and her mare to transport granite from the creek bed 2 miles away. The stones filled the space behind her cabin, a small mountain of gray rock that the neighbors found even more mystifying than the hole. What does she need all those rocks for? Building a wall, maybe. Wall around what? She's got nothing worth protecting. Maybe the rocks are for her head. Keep it from floating away now that she's gone completely crazy. Sigrid heard the jokes and the judgments and continued working. The stone lining took 3 weeks. She and 2 hawks fitted the river rocks together like puzzle pieces, mortaring them in place with clay she'd mixed herself from creek bottom mud and straw. The work was precise, demanding, requiring a patience that most frontier tasks didn't allow for. Each stone had to seat properly against its neighbors. Each seam had to be sealed against moisture. The floor of the chamber, the walls, even parts of the ceiling where the cabin joists crossed above all, lined with granite capable of holding heat for hours after the fire that warmed it had died to ash. But the chamber itself was only half the system. The chimney modification was what made the neighbors stop laughing and start worrying. Captain Rourke rode over from his place 3 miles north on the day Sigrid was mortaring the last stones into place. He dismounted and studied the excavation through the gaps in the floorboards she'd temporarily removed. His face was unreadable, but his questions were sharp. "You've redirected the flue," he said. It wasn't a question. Part of it, he pointed at the channel that curved away from the main chimney stack and descended through a hole in the cabin floor. "Where does that go?" "Through the stone chamber. Loops through 6 times before rejoining the main stack and venting outside. You're running hot chimney gases through an underground rock pile." "Yes. The smoke will back up. You'll suffocate before Christmas." Sigrid climbed out of the excavation and wiped clay from her hands. The negative pressure still pulls the smoke upward through the main chimney. But before the hot gases escape completely, they pass through the stone mass, give up their heat, then rise through the outlet and vent normally. Rourke was silent for a long moment. He walked around the edge of the exposed floor, studying the system from different angles. 2 hawks had gone home for the day, but the evidence of his work was everywhere. "This is Roman Rourke," finally said. "The Hippocaust system. They used it to heat bathhouses, and Korean, and Swedish, and Russian. Different names, same principle. I've read about it. Never seen anyone try to build one. My grandfather heated a farmhouse with this method for 50 years. In Sweden, where the winters make Montana look mild." Rourke shook his head slowly. His expression had shifted from curiosity to something closer to concern. "Heat rises, Mrs. Halverson. Always has, always will. You're fighting a fundamental law of nature. Heat radiates," she corrected him, "in all directions, up, down, sideways. Stone absorbs it and releases it slowly over time. The reason we think heat only rises is because we build our houses wrong. We let it escape up chimneys instead of capturing it in mass." He snorted. It wasn't a cruel sound, just the noise a practical man makes when confronted with theory that contradicts experience. "Ma'am, you've got maybe 5 cords of wood split and winter's 2 months away. You're going to burn through that wood twice as fast, trying to heat 4 tons of underground rock. Come February, you'll be burning furniture. Come March, we'll find you frozen." Sigrid met his gaze. She was tired. Tired in her bones from weeks of labor. Tired in her heart from months of grief. But beneath the exhaustion was something harder. "Come February, Captain Rourke, I'll be burning half the wood you are, and sleeping warmer than you've slept since you left whatever heated house you grew up in back east." His eyebrows rose. "That's quite a claim." "It is." He mounted his horse and gathered the reins. For a moment he sat looking down at her, this 41-year-old widow covered in clay and river mud, making predictions about a winter she had no business surviving. "I'll check on you come January," he said. "If you're alive, I'll bring you a cord of wood and an apology. If you're not, I'll bury you next to Gunner and tell folks you died proving something that couldn't be proved." He rode away without waiting for a response. Sigrid watched him go, then turned back to her work. The system was nearly complete. Josiah Kincaid called a meeting at his homestead the following Sunday. Nearly every family in the Stillwater Creek settlement attended. 14 households represented 63 souls total, gathered in Kincaid's large cabin to discuss what he called a matter of community concern. Sigrid wasn't invited, but she heard about it anyway. The frontier had few secrets. "She's going to die," Kincaid told the assembled settlers. "We all know it. The question is what we do about it." "What can we do?" asked Abigail Sutter. "She's a grown woman. We can't force her to sell. Abigail was 29, Texas-born, and had survived things that would have broken most people. She'd lost 2 babies to cholera on the wagon trail north. She'd walked 47 miles when their ox went lame. She approached frontier life with a pragmatism that bordered on grim, but she wasn't cruel. And she didn't like the direction this meeting was heading. "We could buy her out," Kincaid suggested. "Pool our resources. Offer her a fair price before winter makes travel impossible." "She doesn't want to sell," said Daniel Sutter, Abigail's husband. "I asked her just last week. She said she's staying. Then she's a fool, and fools die in this country." Captain Rourke spoke up from his position near the door. "I saw her system. The underground heating. It's not madness." The room went quiet. Rourke didn't speak often at community gatherings, and when he did, people listened. "It's based on Roman engineering," he continued. "I've read about it. The principle is sound." "Sound in theory," Kincaid shot back. "This isn't Rome. This is Montana territory. 20 below zero for weeks at a time. Wind that cuts through anything. You can't fight that with a hole full of rocks." "The Romans conquered half the known world," Rourke said. "They understood a few things about engineering. And they fell. Their empire collapsed. Maybe because they spent too much time building elaborate heating systems instead of practical solutions." The debate continued for another hour, but no consensus emerged. Some settlers thought Sigrid should be pressured to sell for her own good. Others argued for leaving her alone to succeed or fail on her own terms. A few, mostly the women, suggested taking turns checking on her through the winter, making sure she had food and firewood. In the end, they agreed on nothing except to wait and see. November came in cold and stayed cold. Temperatures dropped below freezing on the 3rd of the month and didn't rise above it for the next 6 weeks. The creek developed ice at its edges. The mud froze into ridges that made wagon travel difficult. And Sigrid Halverson completed her underground heating system. She sealed the last section of clay mortar on November 15th. The floorboards went back in place, fitted tightly over the stone chamber below. From the outside, the cabin looked no different than it had when Gunner was alive. Same log walls, same stone chimney rising 14 feet above the roofline, but beneath the floor, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look, 4 tons of river granite waited in a clay-lined chamber, connected to the chimney by channels that would carry hot gases through the stone mass before allowing them to escape. 2 hawks came by on the morning of the 16th. He stood in the cabin and looked at the floor beneath his feet. "How long until you know if it works?" Sigrid had built a fire in the fireplace, a big fire burning hot and fast-consuming wood at a rate that would have alarmed her a month ago. But this wasn't normal heating. This was charging the system. 3 weeks to fully heat the stone mass. After that, 4 hours of good burning should maintain it for 20 hours of warmth. And if it doesn't work, then Captain Rourke buries me next to Gunner, and you can tell everyone the Swedish woman died proving nothing. 2 hawks smiled faintly. "The stone will work," he said. "My grandmother's grandmother knew it. Your grandfather knew it. The Romans knew it. Knowledge that old doesn't lie." He left without saying goodbye, which was the Crow way. Sigrid fed the fire and waited for the stones beneath her feet to remember what heat felt like. The first week was discouraging. She burned wood at a rate that made her calculations seem wildly optimistic, feeding the fire almost continuously. watching the carefully stacked cords diminish while the cabin temperature stayed stubbornly normal. The stone mass was absorbing the heat she knew, but it gave no sign of returning it. The floor remained cool to the touch. The walls stayed cold. If anything, the cabin seemed draftier than before, as though the underground chamber was sucking warmth downward instead of storing it. Kincaid stopped by on the 5th day, his face arranged in false sympathy. "Heard you're burning through wood pretty fast." Sigrid didn't invite him inside. "The system is charging. Charging." He pronounced the word as though it were foreign. Like a cavalry charge, like a battery storing electricity. The stone absorbs heat, now releases it later. "Mrs. Halverson." Kincaid's tone shifted from condescending to something almost gentle. "I've lived in this valley 7 years. I've seen a lot of people try new methods. Try to outsmart the winner. It always ends the same way. You can't beat nature by being clever. My grandfather beat Swedish winners for 50 years with this system. Your grandfather isn't here. And Sweden, I hear, has forests dense enough to supply infinite firewood. We don't have that luxury." She looked at him steadily. "Is there something you wanted, Mr. Kincaid?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I'm prepared to make you an offer on the property. $1,500 cash. That's fair money considering the improvements Gunnar made. The property is not for sale. Mrs. Halverson." "Good day, Mr. Kincaid." She closed the door before he could respond. Through the window, she watched him ride away, his back stiff with irritation. $1,500. Enough to live modestly for several years in a city back east. Enough to admit defeat with dignity, retreat to civilization. Spend her remaining decades as a cautious spinster in someone else's household. She fed another log into the fire and pressed her palm against the floorboards. Still cool. But somehow, perhaps it was imagination, slightly less cool than yesterday. The change came in the 2nd week. Subtle at first. Sigrid woke one morning to find that the water in her bedside cup hadn't developed its usual skin of ice. The cabin temperature, which had been hovering around 45 degrees at dawn, registered 52. She knelt and pressed both palms flat against the floor. Warmth, faint but unmistakable, rising through the wood from the stone chamber below. By the end of the 3rd week, the floor was warm enough that walking barefoot felt like a small luxury. The cabin interior held at 64 degrees at dawn, 8 degrees warmer than the previous winter, with the same amount of fire. The stone mass beneath the floor, now heated to temperatures exceeding 200 degrees during evening burns, released its stored warmth slowly through the night. She could let the fire die down to coals after midnight, and still wake to a cabin that didn't have frost on the inside walls. Abigail Sutter stopped by in the 3rd week of December. She came with the excuse of returning a borrowed pie tin, but her real purpose was curiosity. The whole settlement was talking about the Swedish widow's underground heating, and Abigail was practical enough to want first-hand information. She stood in the center of the cabin and looked around. Her breath didn't fog in the air. Her fingers didn't ache from cold. "It's warm," she admitted, "but you've been burning steady for weeks." What happens when you run low on wood? Sigrid poured 2 cups of coffee. Real coffee, a luxury she allowed herself in winter. The stones don't suck heat once they're charged. They hold it, release it slow. I burn hot fires twice a day instead of low fires all day. Uses 40% less wood for the same warmth. Abigail's eyes narrowed. She was calculating, running the mathematics of survival. How long to charge the stones the first time? 3 weeks. And now 4 hours of good burning maintains them for 20 hours of warmth. Abigail set down her coffee cup and knelt to touch the floor. Her hand jerked back slightly. Not painfully hot, but warm. Warm as summer stone. "My boy Henry's been coughing," she said, quietly. "The cold gets into his lungs every winter." Sigrid nodded. Henry Sutter was 4 years old, small for his age, prone to the respiratory ailments that kill more children on the frontier than any other cause. "Warm floors help sick children breathe easier," Sigrid said. "The moisture doesn't freeze in their lungs." Abigail stood. Her face revealed nothing, but she lingered longer than a simple pie tin return would warrant. She walked the perimeter of the cabin, feeling the walls, testing the window frames for drafts. "Daniel thinks you're crazy," she finally said. "Most people do. Daniel thinks everyone who doesn't do things his way is crazy." She paused at the door. "I don't think you're crazy, Mrs. Halverson. I think you're desperate enough to try something different. Desperate people sometimes find solutions comfortable people miss." She left without committing to belief, but also without mocking. That was progress. The next morning, clouds began building on the northern horizon. The Crow elders had seen too many magpies flocking early. Too many beaver dams built higher than usual. The woolly bear caterpillars showed more black than brown. All the signs pointed to a winter that would test every structure, every woodpile, every survival calculation in the Stillwater Creek Valley. And Sigrid Halverson, alone in her cabin, with 4 tons of heated stone beneath her feet, watched the clouds gather and felt something she hadn't felt since August. Not confidence exactly, not certainty, but readiness, a willingness to meet whatever came next. The storm would arrive in 3 days. It would drop temperatures to 29 below zero. It would kill livestock in their barns and children in their beds. And it would prove once and for all whether the wisdom of a Swedish grandfather could survive a Montana winter. The clouds that gathered on the northern horizon on December 20th were not ordinary winter clouds. They were black as bruises stacked in towering columns that reached so high they seemed to scrape the roof of the sky itself. Old-timers who had survived the winter of 1872 looked at those clouds and felt something cold settle in their stomachs that had nothing to do with temperature. Sigrid stood at her cabin window and watched them build. The barometric pressure had been dropping for 2 days. A subtle change she felt in her joints and sinuses before she understood what it meant. The horses in her small corral were restless, pacing and snorting their breath, fogging in air that grew colder by the hour. 2 hawks appeared at her door that afternoon. He rarely came to the settlement anymore, preferring to keep his distance from white neighbors who viewed his presence with suspicion. But something had driven him 3 miles through the bitter cold. "Bad storm coming," he said without preamble. "My grandmother says the worst in 20 winters." Sigrid nodded. "The signs all point that way. The elders are moving the camp to the sheltered canyon." He paused, studying her face. "You should come with us. Bring your horse, your food. Wait out the storm where the wind cannot reach." She considered the offer. It was generous, more than generous. The Crow had no obligation to shelter a white widow, no reason to share their resources with someone outside their community. "Thank you," she said, "but I need to stay with my cabin." Two hawks glanced at the floor beneath his feet. The heated stones. If I leave now, the system loses its charge. I'd have to start over after the storm, and I might not have enough wood left to heat the mass again. He was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded once, a gesture of acceptance rather than approval. "The stones will remember," he said. "My grandmother's grandmother would have understood what you're building here." He left without another word, disappearing into the gray afternoon like smoke dissolving into fog. Sigrid watched him go, then turned back to her preparations. The storm would hit within 48 hours. She had that long to ready herself for whatever came next. The next day, December 21st, the shortest day of the year, Sigrid worked from dawn until darkness fell at 4:30 in the afternoon. She hauled water from the creek and filled every container she owned, knowing the creek would freeze solid within hours of the storm's arrival. She brought in firewood until the stack beside her fireplace reached the ceiling, enough for 2 weeks of continuous burning if necessary. She checked the clay seals around her chimney flue, patched the gaps where winter wind might force its way through the cabin walls. Captain Rourke rode by in the late afternoon. He didn't dismount, just sat his horse in her dooryard and watched her work. "Storm coming," he said. "I know. Bad one by the look of those clouds. I've prepared." He shifted in his saddle leather, creaking in the cold. His breath plumed white in air that had dropped to 12 degrees and was still falling. "My offer stands," he said. "If you need shelter, my cabin is 3 miles north. Solid construction, good chimney, room for one more." Sigrid straightened from the firewood she'd been stacking. She looked at him directly. This practical man who had promised to bury her if her system failed. "Your offer is kind, Captain. But I built this system to survive exactly this kind of storm. If I run at the first test, I'll never know if it works. You might not survive to find out if it doesn't. Then at least I'll die learning something true." Rourke stared at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. A flicker of emotion that might have been respect or might have been the recognition of a fellow stubborn soul. "I'll check on you after the storm breaks," he said. 3 days, maybe 4 if the weather holds as long as it looks like it might. He rode away into the gathering dusk. Sigrid watched until horse and rider disappeared into the gray distance, then went inside to build up her fire. The temperature at midnight was 4 degrees above zero. By dawn on December 22nd, it had dropped to 6 below, and the storm had not yet arrived. Sigrid spent the day monitoring her system. She built fires in the morning and evening hot burns that lasted 4 hours each, pushing heat down through the redirected flue and into the stone mass beneath her floor. The cabin interior held at 61 degrees, even as the outside temperature continued to fall. The floor radiated warmth upward through the boards, a gentle heat that made the room feel larger, somehow more comfortable than any frontier dwelling had a right to feel. She allowed herself a small measure of hope. The system was working. The stones were charged. Whatever the storm brought, she would face it with 4 tons of heated granite between her and the frozen earth. The clouds reached Stillwater Creek at 2:15 in the afternoon on December 23rd. Sigrid was standing at her window when the leading edge of the storm crossed the valley. One moment the sky was gray, but visible the distant mountains a smudge on the western horizon. The next moment everything vanished. The world turned white, then gray, then a darkness that had nothing to do with the hour. The wind hit like a physical blow. The cabin walls shuddered. The chimney moaned as gusts tried to force their way down the flue. Snow began falling so thick and fast that visibility dropped to less than 20 feet within minutes, and the temperature plummeted. Sigrid had seen cold before. Swedish winters, Minnesota winters, the ordinary Montana cold that settled in for weeks at a time. But this was different. This was cold as a predator, cold as a living thing hunting for weakness. By 4 o'clock, the temperature outside had dropped to 23 below zero. By 6 o'clock, 29 below. By midnight, the mercury in her outdoor thermometer had retreated into the bulb and refused to register at all. Inside the cabin, Sigrid built her evening fire. She burned hot for 4 hours, feeding the flames with split pine and seasoned cottonwood, pushing the firebox temperature high enough that the iron glowed dull red in places. The underground flue carried the hot gases through the stone chamber in its serpentine path. 6 passes through 4 tons of granite before the cooled smoke rejoined the main chimney and vented into the howling darkness above. At 10 o'clock, she let the fire burn down to coals. At midnight, she added 2 logs, more out of habit than necessity. At 2 in the morning, when the wind was screaming loud enough to sound like a woman in grief, when the temperature outside had dropped to 34 below, when the darkness was so complete, it felt like the sun had never existed. Sigrid Halvorsson's cabin interior measured 59 degrees Fahrenheit. She slept in her flannel nightdress with a single wool blanket, and she dreamed of her grandfather's farmhouse in Uppsala, where the great tile stove radiated warmth through winter nights that lasted 18 hours, where stone remembered heat, the way old men remember their youth, where survival was not a battle but a rhythm, a dance with the seasons that her people had learned over centuries of practice. 3 miles to the north, Captain Nathaniel Rourke was not sleeping. He'd built his fire at sundown and fed it continuously, since adding logs every hour. As the temperature in his cabin dropped despite his efforts, the wind found gaps in his walls he hadn't known existed, forcing its way through cracks around the window frames beneath the door, through the junction where chimney met roof. By midnight, his cabin interior had fallen to 47 degrees. By 2 o'clock, 43. His hands were stiff when he tried to reload the firebox. His fingers fumbled with the logs, dropping them twice before managing to shove them into the flames. The fire roared and crackled, throwing heat that dissipated almost immediately, rising toward the ceiling and escaping through the roof while the floor remained cold as a tomb. Rourke wrapped himself in every blanket he owned and sat as close to the fire as he could without singeing his beard. He thought about the Swedish widow 3 miles south, wondered if she was still alive, wondered if her stone chamber was performing as she'd promised, or if she was already freezing to death in the darkness. He thought about riding to check on her, then dismissed the idea. No horse could survive in this wind. No man could navigate when he couldn't see 10 feet in front of his face. If Sigrid Halvorsson was dying, she would die alone, and there was nothing he could do about it. Rourke fed another log into his fire and watched the flames consume it in minutes. 7 miles to the southeast, Josiah Kincaid was cursing steadily under his breath. His cabin was larger than most, built to shelter his family and the hired hands who worked his property during planting and harvest. But size was a liability in weather like this. More space meant more air to heat, more walls for the wind to penetrate, more opportunities for warmth to escape. Kincaid's 2 sons, grown men in their 20s, took turns feeding the stove. One would sleep for 2 hours while the other maintained the fire. Then they'd switch. Even so, the temperature inside never rose above 45 degrees. Ice formed in the water bucket by the door. Frost crept across the inside of the windows, growing thicker as the night wore on. Kincaid's wife, Margaret, wore every layer she owned and still shivered beneath 3 quilts. She hadn't complained once since the storm began, but Kincaid could see the fear in her eyes, the knowledge that they were losing a battle they couldn't afford to lose. "That Swedish woman," she said quietly at one point during the endless night. "Do you think she's all right?" Kincaid snorted. "That Swedish woman is probably frozen solid by now, playing with rocks while sensible people built proper woodpiles." But Margaret wasn't convinced. She'd heard the stories about the warm cabin, the heated floor. She'd dismissed them as exaggeration, at the time the frontier tendency to inflate any unusual occurrence into legend. Now huddled beneath inadequate blankets while the wind tried to tear the roof off their home, she wondered. The Sutter cabin was the smallest in the valley, and by dawn on December 24th, it had become a death trap. Daniel and Abigail had built their fire as hot as their small stove could manage, but the heat disappeared as fast as they could produce it. The single room measured 16 feet by 14 feet, and at 2 in the morning the temperature inside had dropped to 37 degrees. Their children huddled together in the bed, 6-year-old Martha and 8-year-old Catherine, wrapped around their 4-year-old brother Henry, sharing body heat, because there wasn't enough warmth in the cabin to keep them comfortable separately. Henry had started coughing at midnight. By 2 o'clock, the cough had developed a rattling quality that made Abigail's chest tighten with fear. She'd heard that sound before in the wagon trail camps, where children sickened and died within days. The cold had gotten into his lungs somehow, settling in the moist tissue, turning breath into a battle. She held him close to the stove, but the heat didn't penetrate. The fire threw warmth a few feet in every direction, then surrendered to the cold that pressed in from all sides. She could feel the temperature drop every time Daniel opened the door to bring in more wood, feel the precious heat escape while frozen air rushed in to replace it. Henry's small body shook with each cough. His forehead was hot despite the cold cabin fever building as his body tried to fight off whatever had invaded his lungs. Daniel went out twice more to bring in firewood, losing feeling in his fingers both times despite thick gloves. The woodpile was dwindling faster than he'd calculated, faster than it should have. At this rate, they'd run out before the storm broke. He didn't tell Abigail. She had enough to worry about. By dawn, Henry's breathing had turned shallow, and his lips had begun to show the faint blue tinge that meant his body was losing the fight to stay warm. Sigrid woke at 6 in the morning to a cabin that measured 57 degrees. She'd slept 6 hours straight, the longest unbroken rest she'd had since Gunnar died. The fire had burned down to ash and a few glowing coals. Yet the warmth persisted, rising through the floorboards in gentle waves. Outside, the storm raged on. The wind had not diminished. The snow continued to fall in sheets so thick that she couldn't see her own woodpile 30 feet from the door. But inside her cabin, the temperature had dropped only 4 degrees in 6 hours without additional fuel. She built her morning fire, a smaller burn than the previous evening, just enough to maintain the stone mass below. The system was working exactly as her grandfather had described, exactly as the Romans had discovered 2,000 years ago. Stone remembers heat, and 4 tons of granite properly charged could remember for a very long time. Sigrid made coffee on the revived coals and ate a breakfast of dried venison and hard bread. She checked her supplies, verified her water stores, calculated how long she could sustain herself if the storm lasted a week. Then she sat by the window and watched the white chaos outside and thought about her neighbors. Kincaid would be fine. Unpleasant cold burning through wood at an alarming rate, but fine. His cabin was well built, his stores deep. He'd survive on stubbornness alone if nothing else. Rourke was more concerning. His cabin was solid, but he lived alone. If something happened, if he slipped on ice or cut himself with an axe, there'd be no one to help. The Sutters. Abigail's face rose in her memory. The woman who hadn't mocked but hadn't believed either. The woman with the coughing child. Sigrid thought about 4-year-old Henry, his small lungs struggling against winter air that froze moisture into ice crystals. She thought about what cold did to sick children, how quickly they could decline when their bodies couldn't find warmth. She thought about her own cabin, 60 degrees with minimal fire, warm enough to heal instead of just survive. At 7:30, she saw movement through the storm. A figure barely visible, struggling through snow that had drifted 3 feet deep in places. The figure fell. Rose fell again. Kept coming despite the wind that tried to knock it horizontal. Sigrid had the door open before Abigail Sutter reached the porch. The woman collapsed into the cabin. Her shawl inadequate, her face raw and red from cold and wind. She gasped for breath, her chest heaving, tears freezing on her cheeks almost as fast as they formed. "Henry," she managed. "He can't breathe right. The cold's in his lungs." Sigrid didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed Gunner's old coat from its hook by the door, wrapped a wool scarf around her face, and took Abigail's arm. "Take me to him." The 300 yards between Sigrid's cabin and the Sutter place felt like 3 miles. The wind hit them with physical force the moment they stepped outside, driving snow into their eyes, their mouths, every gap in their clothing. The cold was so intense it burned a searing pain that made Sigrid's lungs ache with every breath. Abigail knew the way by instinct, navigating through a world without landmarks, without visibility, without anything except white chaos and howling wind. She fell twice. Sigrid fell once. They helped each other up and kept moving. The Sutter cabin emerged from the storm like a ghost, a dark shape that solidified slowly as they approached. Daniel had the door open before they reached it, his face a mask of fear and exhaustion. Inside, the cold hit Sigrid like a wall. The cabin couldn't have been above 40 degrees. The stove was burning flames visible through the grate, but the heat dissipated within feet of the iron box. The walls radiated cold. The floor felt like standing on ice. Henry lay in the bed piled under every quilt the family owned. His sisters flanked him, their small bodies pressed against his, trying to share warmth they didn't have. His breathing was raspy and irregular, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a rattling wheeze. Sigrid crossed to the bed and laid her hand on his forehead, hot with fever. She pulled back the quilts and looked at his lips. Blue. Not dark blue, not yet, but the warning shade that came before the body began shutting down. She made a decision in 3 seconds. Bundle him. Bring him to my place. Bring all the children. Daniel started to protest. "Your cabin is 300 yards further into the storm." "My cabin is 60 degrees, Sigrid said. "It has been all night. It will be when we arrive." "Your son is dying, Mr. Sutter. He's dying because his body can't find enough warmth to fight whatever's in his lungs. Every minute he stays here, he gets weaker. Daniel looked at his wife. Abigail's face was streaked with frozen tears, but her eyes were steady. "She's right," Abigail said. "I felt her cabin. It's warm, warm like summer." Daniel hesitated one more moment. Then he nodded. They moved quickly. Abigail wrapped Henry in wool blankets and a sheepskin she'd been saving for a special occasion. Daniel gathered Martha and Catherine, both crying from cold and fear. Sigrid took Henry from his mother's arms, holding the boy against her chest, feeling his small body shake with each labored breath. The return journey was worse than the first. The wind had strengthened. The snow was falling faster. And now they were 4 adults and 3 children, the youngest of whom was fighting for his life. Sigrid led the way. She couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead, but she'd walked this path 1,000 times since August. Her feet knew the terrain even when her eyes couldn't find it. She moved by instinct, by memory, by sheer determination, not to let this child die in a storm that her system had been built to defeat. Henry coughed against her shoulder, a wet sound that sprayed warmth against her neck. He was so small, so fragile. His life measured in hours if they didn't find warmth soon. The cabin emerged from the whiteness like salvation. Sigrid shouldered through the door, and the contrast hit like a physical force. Warmth, immediate, enveloping, radiating from every surface. The Sutter family stumbled in behind her, and for a moment they just stood there, disbelieving, as the cold that had been killing them was replaced by something that felt impossible. "Jesus, Mary," Daniel whispered. Sigrid carried Henry to her bed, which sat directly above the hottest section of the stone chamber. She laid him down, stripped off his damp outer layers, wrapped him in dry blankets that had been sitting in the warm cabin all night. The boy's breathing was still labored, still rattling, but within minutes, something changed. The shaking diminished. His body stopped fighting to generate heat and began using its energy to heal instead. Abigail knelt beside the bed, her hand on her son's chest, feeling each breath. Tears ran down her cheeks, but these were different tears. Relief instead of fear. "How," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "How is it so warm?" Sigrid explained briefly. "The stone chamber. The redirected flue. The thermal mass that absorbed heat and released it slowly over hours." Daniel touched the floor with his bare palm and jerked it back. Not painfully hot, but warm. Warm as the floor of a house in summer. Martha and Catherine had stopped crying. 6-year-old Martha took off her mittens. 8-year-old Catherine asked if she could sit on the floor. And when her mother nodded, both girls stretched out on the boards like cats finding sunshine. Daniel walked the perimeter of the cabin, feeling the walls, the window frames. Everything was warmer than it should be. Everything radiated the gentle heat that came from mass, not flame. "You built this," he said. "You built this underground heating system, and everyone told you it wouldn't work. Everyone," Sigrid agreed, "was wrong." The storm lasted 3 days. Word spread the way it does in isolated communities, even when travel is impossible. Someone saw the Sutters struggling through the snow toward the Halverson cabin. Someone else saw Daniel make a brief trip back to his own place to retrieve food and more clothing. By the second day of the storm, the entire valley knew that the Swedish widow's cabin had become a refuge. Captain Rourke arrived on the morning of December 25th, Christmas Day. He'd saddled his horse before dawn and ridden through the dying wind, arriving at Sigrid's door coated in snow. His eyebrows frozen, his fingers so numb he couldn't unfasten his own coat. He stepped inside and stopped the same shock on his face that had appeared on Daniel Sutter's face the day before. 62 degrees, Sigrid said. Would you like coffee, Captain? Rourke didn't answer immediately. He was too busy absorbing what he was seeing. The Sutter family, all 5 of them comfortable and warm. Henry, sitting up in bed, still coughing occasionally, but breathing without the terrifying rattle. The fire burning low, almost neglected, while the cabin stayed warm through some mechanism he'd dismissed as fantasy. I owe you an apology, he finally said. You owe me a cord of wood. The apology you can keep. He almost smiled. Then he went to the door and looked back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. I'm going to ride to Kincaid's place. He's got a wife who's been shivering for 3 days. If this storm keeps up, she might not make it. Bring them here, Sigrid said. There's room. Rourke nodded and disappeared into the storm. By that evening, 7 more people had crowded into Sigrid's cabin. Josiah Kincaid and his wife, Margaret, their 2 grown sons and the younger son's wife, Rourke himself, who hadn't gone back to his own cold cabin. 13 people in a space designed for 2. And still the temperature never dropped below 56 degrees. Kincaid sat on the floor above the stone chamber and felt heat rising through boards that had been in Gunnar Halvorsson's family since they'd emigrated from Sweden 30 years ago. He was silent for a long time, this man who had called her crazy, who had predicted her death, who had offered to buy her property at a discount because he assumed she wouldn't survive to refuse. Finally, he spoke. It's a hippocaust, he said, like the Romans built. Sigrid nodded. She was making coffee for 13 people, a task that required her largest pot and nearly all her remaining beans. My grandfather called it a Kakeluggen system, tile stove heating with thermal mass. The Romans had the right idea 2,000 years ago. Korea still uses it. Russia uses it. We forgot it when we came west. Kincaid shook his head slowly. His wife, Margaret, sat beside him wrapped in a blanket. She didn't need, still unable to believe she could be warm without sitting directly beside a roaring fire. I've built 3 cabins in this valley, Kincaid said, each one better than the last. And none of them ever felt like this. That's because you built them to fight the cold, Sigrid said. I built this one to store the heat. Captain Rourke, who had been silent since bringing the Kincaids, finally spoke. How much stone did you move? 4 tons, roughly. Maybe more. River rock, mostly granite. Dense stone holds heat better than sandstone. And the flue system. How'd you keep the smoke from backing up? Sigrid lifted a floorboard, showing them the clay-lined channel that curved through the stone mass below. Negative pressure still pulls smoke up through the main chimney, but before the hot gases escape, they give up their heat to the mass. I lose maybe 10% to backdraft on bad wind days. Worth it for tripling my heat retention. Daniel Sutter, who had been watching his son sleep peacefully for the first time in 3 days, said what everyone else was thinking. You could have kept this secret. Sold it. Made money off it. Sigrid replaced the floorboard. My husband always said knowledge that keeps people alive shouldn't be hoarded. Besides, who would I sell it to? We're all trying to survive the same winter. The room was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind still howled, still drove snow against the walls, still tried to find weakness in the cabin's defenses. But inside, 13 people sat in warmth they hadn't expected to find save by a system they'd mocked a month ago. Margaret Kincaid was the first to speak. "Mrs. Halverson," she said softly. "Thank you." It was the first kind word anyone in the Kincaid family had spoken to Sigrid since her husband died. On the morning of December 26th, the wind began to fade. By noon, the snow had stopped falling. By evening, the clouds were breaking apart, revealing a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. The temperature was still brutal, 18 below zero at sunset. But without the wind, it felt almost survivable. The families who had sheltered in Sigrid's cabin began gathering their things, preparing for the journey back to their own homesteads to assess the damage. But before they left, something happened that Sigrid hadn't expected. Josiah Kincaid approached her as she was banking the fire for the night. His face was difficult to read. Pride and shame, and something else warring for dominance. "Mrs. Halverson," he said. He cleared his throat. "When the ground thaws in spring, I'd like you to show me how to build one of these systems." Sigrid looked at him steadily. The man who had predicted her death. The man who had tried to buy her land at a discount. The man who had called her crazy to anyone who would listen. "I'd be happy to, Mr. Kincaid." He nodded awkwardly and moved away. Behind him, Captain Rourke was smiling faintly. Daniel Sutter came next. He held Henry in his arms, the boy wrapped in blankets, even though the cabin was warm enough that blankets weren't necessary. Henry's breathing was clear now. The rattle gone, his color returned to normal. "My son is alive because of you," Daniel said. "I don't know how to repay that." "Help someone else," Sigrid said. "When you can. That's all the payment I need." Abigail Sutter hugged her a fierce embrace that said more than words could have. Then she took Henry from her husband's arms and followed the other families out into the frozen evening. Sigrid stood in her doorway and watched them go. 13 people, all alive, all warm, all returning to homes that would need repairs and restocking and the long labor of recovery. But they were alive. She closed the door and pressed her palm against the floorboards, still warm. The fire had burned down to coals hours ago, but the stone remembered. The stone always remembered. Outside, the Stillwater Creek Valley was assessing the damage from the worst storm in 5 years. In the Brennan household 3 miles west, 2 calves had frozen in the barn, despite their mother's body heat. In the Morrison family's root cellar, half their potato stores had turned to black mush when the temperature dropped low enough to freeze vegetables underground. And in the valley as a whole, 5 people had died. An elderly man named Hoskins who lived alone and had run out of firewood on the second day. A mother and infant child on the northern edge of the settlement. Their cabin too poorly constructed to withstand the wind. 2 brothers who had tried to ride for help during the height of the storm and had been found frozen in a snowdrift 100 yards from their own door. 5 deaths. It could have been more, should have been more given the severity of the storm and the inadequate preparations most families had made. But 13 people who might have been among that number had spent 3 days in a cabin that stayed warm while the world outside tried to kill them. 13 people who now knew that a 41-year-old Swedish widow had built something worth believing in. On December 28th, when the trails had been broken open enough for travel, a steady stream of visitors began arriving at Sigrid's cabin. They came with questions about excavation depth and stone type, about clay mixtures and flue angles, about how long the system took to charge and how long the charge lasted. They came with measurements and notebooks with offers of help and expressions of respect that hadn't been there before. Captain Rourke came with detailed drawings he'd made of the flue system, asking permission to copy the design for his own cabin. Sigrid gave it freely. Josiah Kincaid came with his oldest son, both of them armed with questions about thermal mass and heat retention that showed they'd been thinking seriously about what they'd experienced. Sigrid answered every question. Daniel Sutter came with an offer that surprised her. "I'll give you 2 weeks of labor in spring," he said. "Help you with whatever needs fixing after hosting half the valley for 3 days. It's the least I can do." Sigrid accepted, not because she needed the help, but because accepting meant Daniel could feel he'd repaid some of the debt he believed he owed. And little Henry Sutter came with his mother fully recovered. Now his lungs clear, his color healthy. He didn't understand what had happened, or why only that the nice lady's house had a warm floor, and that he'd felt better there than he'd felt anywhere else. "Can we come back?" he asked Sigrid. "When it gets cold again, you can come back whenever you want." Sigrid told him, "The stones will remember you." By New Year's Day, when the temperature had risen to a manageable 12 degrees above zero, and life in the valley had returned to something approaching normal, something fundamental had shifted in the Stillwater Creek settlement. They no longer looked at Sigrid Halverson as the crazy Swedish widow who dug a hole beneath her cabin. They looked at her as the woman who'd survived a storm that killed 5 people, kept 13 others alive, and done it all while burning half the wood anyone else consumed. They looked at her with respect, and more importantly, they looked at her with questions. How do I build one of these systems for myself? What kind of stone works best? How deep does the chamber need to be? Sigrid answered them all. She drew diagrams in the dirt. She explained principles that her grandfather had explained to her 40 years ago in a farmhouse outside Uppsala. She shared knowledge that had kept her people alive through Swedish winters that made Montana look mild. And she did it freely, without asking for payment, without hoarding secrets that could save lives. Because that was what her husband would have wanted. Because that was what her grandfather would have done. Because knowledge that keeps people alive shouldn't be forgotten. The first thaw came in late February. The ground softened enough for digging, and 4 families in the Stillwater Creek Valley began excavating chambers beneath their cabin floors. The system that everyone had mocked in November had become the most sought-after innovation in the territory by March. And Sigrid Halverson, who had been expected to sell her land and flee back to civilization, stood on her porch in the weakening winter sun and watched her neighbors dig holes of their own. She was 41 years old. She had no children. Her husband was 4 months in the ground. But she had proven something that would outlast all of them. Stone remembers heat. And sometimes when you build something true, the world remembers too. The spring of 1878 arrived late and reluctant, as though winter couldn't quite believe it had been defeated. Snow lingered in the shadowed places until mid-April. The creek ran high with meltwater, threatening to flood the low-lying homesteads before finally settling into its summer channel. But the settlers of Stillwater Creek barely noticed the difficult thaw. They were too busy digging. Josiah Kincaid started first breaking ground on March 15th, when the frost had retreated just deep enough to allow a shovel's blade. He'd spent the winter months planning measuring sketching designs based on what he'd seen in Sigrid's cabin. His excavation would be larger than hers, deeper, lined with granite hauled from a quarry 19 miles distant. His sons thought he'd lost his mind. The same thing they'd said about Sigrid 6 months earlier. But Kincaid had felt that warmth rising through floorboards while the worst storm in memory raged outside. He'd sat on heated stone while his own cabin 3 miles away grew ice on its interior walls. He'd learned something during those 3 days that no amount of frontier experience had taught him. Sometimes the old ways were better. Captain Nathaniel Rourke took a different approach. Instead of retrofitting his existing cabin, he decided to build new. A fresh structure designed from the foundation up to incorporate thermal mass heating. He spent March and April acquiring materials, May and June on construction. And by July, he had a cabin unlike anything else in Montana territory. The stone chamber wasn't beneath the floor. It was the floor. And the walls. Rourke had built the entire foundation from river granite, 3 feet thick in places with channels running through the masonry that connected to a central firebox. The design was his own, adapted from Sigrid's principles, but engineered with the precision of a man who'd spent years in the military, learning that details meant survival. He'd done mathematics, calculated heat loss per degree of temperature difference, computed thermal conductivity coefficients for different stone types, determined optimal flue velocity for maximum heat transfer. When he finished, his cabin could maintain 55 degrees for 36 hours after the fire went out completely. Daniel Sutter built the most modest system. His family's resources were limited, their cabin small. But he excavated a chamber 4 feet deep beneath his floor, lined it with stones his children helped him gather from the creek bed, and connected it to his existing chimney with a clay-lined channel that Sigrid helped him design. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't large. But the following winter, when another storm swept through in January, his son Henry slept through the night without coughing once. The warm floor kept the moisture in his lungs from freezing, kept his small body from spending all its energy fighting cold instead of fighting illness. That was worth more than elegance. By autumn of 1878, 4 complete thermal mass systems operated in the Stillwater Creek Valley. By the following spring, the number had doubled. Word spread to neighboring settlements carried by travelers who'd heard stories about the Swedish widow's heated floors. Some dismissed the tales as frontier exaggeration. Others came to see for themselves. Sigrid welcomed them all. She showed them her chamber, explained her design, answered their questions with the patience of a woman who understood that knowledge shared was knowledge multiplied. She asked nothing in return except that they pass the information along to others who might benefit. Some of them did. Some of them didn't. Human nature varied as much on the frontier as it did anywhere else, but the knowledge spread regardless. In the spring of 1880, A man named Henry Porter rode into Stillwater Creek on a government horse with a leather satchel full of census forms. Porter was 35 years old, a federal surveyor tasked with recording homestead improvements throughout Montana Territory. He'd been riding for 6 weeks cataloging barns and wells and irrigation systems, noting which settlements were thriving and which were failing, building the bureaucratic record that Washington used to make decisions about territorial development. He'd heard rumors about unusual heating systems in the Stillwater Creek area. The kind of rumors that government men learned to investigate because unusual often meant innovative and innovative meant worth documenting. What he found exceeded his expectations. He spent 3 days in the valley, moving from cabin to cabin, measuring and sketching and interviewing families. He crawled beneath floorboards to examine stone chambers. He traced flue pathways through clay-lined channels. He recorded temperatures and fuel consumption rates and compared them to standard frontier construction. The numbers told a story that bordered on miraculous. Cabins with thermal mass systems used 40 to 60% less firewood than conventional construction, while maintaining higher interior temperatures. Families reported fewer respiratory illnesses in children, less frostbite damage, better sleep quality during winter months. The initial labor investment substantial, though it was paid for itself within 2 winters through reduced fuel consumption alone. Porter filled 17 pages with notes and diagrams. On his final evening in the valley, he sat in Sigrid Halverson's cabin and asked her questions that went beyond the technical. "Who taught you this?" he asked. "My grandfather, in Sweden when I was a girl. And he learned it from his father. From his father's father, probably. The principle is older than anyone's memory." Porter nodded slowly. He was educated enough to recognize what he was seeing. Not invention, but preservation. Not innovation, but transmission. Knowledge that had survived centuries of use in other places, brought to a new landscape by people who remembered. "The Romans had hypocausts," he said. "I read about them in school." "The Koreans have ondol," Sigrid replied. "The Russians have pechka." Different names for the same understanding. And here in America, we forgot all of it. Here in America, Sigrid said, there was always more forest to cut, more land to move to when the wood ran out. We didn't need to be efficient. So we weren't. Porter wrote that observation down word for word. It would appear in his official report attributed to a Swedish immigrant widow in Stillwater Creek, Montana Territory. He submitted his findings to the territorial government in Helena 3 weeks later. The report ran to 23 pages, including detailed construction diagrams and cost-benefit analyses. His recommendations were specific and emphatic. Implementation of thermal mass heating systems in military installations throughout Montana Territory would reduce fuel costs by an estimated 40%, while improving living conditions for personnel. Similar implementation in government buildings, schools, and hospitals would yield comparable benefits. The technology is proven, the materials locally available, the knowledge accessible through immigrant communities with Northern European heritage. Porter recommended immediate pilot programs at 3 locations. He requested funding for construction materials and skilled labor. He proposed training programs to spread the knowledge throughout the territory. His report landed on a desk in Helena. It was read by a clerk who marked it for review. The clerk passed it to a supervisor who filed it in a cabinet marked Miscellaneous Infrastructure Proposals. The supervisor retired 2 years later, without ever mentioning it to his replacement. Government systems move slowly. Sometimes they don't move at all. The report sat in that cabinet for 47 years. When someone finally rediscovered it in 1927, the paper had yellowed and the ink had faded, but the diagrams were still legible. A historian named Marcus Webb included excerpts in a book about frontier innovation that sold 300 copies and was forgotten by 1935. The knowledge Henry Porter tried to preserve dispersed into the vast indifference of bureaucracy. But in the valley where it mattered, the knowledge lived on. Little Henry Sutter grew up in a cabin warmed by stones beneath the floor. He learned to walk on boards that radiated gentle heat in winter. He learned to read by firelight that didn't need to burn all night. He learned without ever being explicitly taught that warmth was something you stored rather than something you chased. When he was 12, he helped his father expand their system. When he was 16, he built a small heated workshop behind the cabin where he could practice carpentry through the winter months. When he was 19, he left Stillwater Creek to apprentice with a builder in Helena. He came back 6 years later with a wife, a set of professional tools, and a reputation as a craftsman who understood heating in ways other builders didn't. Between 1895 and 1920, Henry Sutter built 17 houses across western Montana. Every single one incorporated some form of thermal mass heating, not always as elaborate as Sigrid's original system. Cities had different requirements than isolated homesteads. Building codes and client budgets imposed constraints that didn't exist on the frontier. But every house Henry Sutter built was designed to store heat rather than waste it. Every house had stone or brick mass positioned to absorb warmth from stoves and fireplaces. Every house stayed warmer through cold nights than its neighbors, burned less fuel through hard winters, provided the quiet comfort that came from understanding how heat actually worked. His clients didn't always know why his houses felt different. They just knew they did. Warmer, they'd say. More comfortable somehow, like the house itself is alive. Henry never explained unless asked, and most people didn't ask. They just enjoyed the warmth and paid his invoices and recommended him to their friends. The knowledge passed through his hands into wood and stone and brick. It survived in structures that outlasted the man who built them. Some of those houses still stand today, their thermal mass systems still functional. After more than a century, still keeping families warm through Montana winters. Henry Sutter died in 1943 at the age of 70. His obituary in the Helena Independent mentioned his carpentry work, his wife and children, his service on the City Planning Commission. It didn't mention thermal mass heating or stone chambers or the Swedish widow who'd saved his life during a blizzard when he was 4 years old. But his children knew the story, and they told their children. And some of those grandchildren still tell it today. Sigrid Halverson lived in her cabin until 1891. She was 55 years old when she finally decided to leave Stillwater Creek. The decision wasn't forced by failure. Her system still worked perfectly after 14 winters. Her health remained good. Her mind stayed sharp. She could have stayed another decade, probably longer. But the frontier was changing around her. Railroads had reached Montana territory in 1883, bringing coal that was cheaper than cutting firewood and easier than hauling river stones. Towns were growing large enough to support commercial fuel suppliers. The desperate ingenuity that had marked the homestead era was giving way to industrial convenience. Her neighbors no longer needed her knowledge. They could buy warmth instead of building it, and she was tired. Tired in the way that 55 years of labor makes a person tired. Tired of maintaining a homestead alone, of fighting weather and wildlife, and the endless demands of frontier survival. Tired of being the keeper of knowledge that fewer and fewer people wanted to learn. Her husband's niece in Helena had invited her to stay. A comfortable room in a warm house, meals she didn't have to cook herself, company after 14 years of solitude. Sigrid sold the cabin to a German couple newly arrived from Bavaria. The Schmidts were young and strong and enthusiastic about their new life in America. They listened carefully as Sigrid explained the heating system, took notes on maintenance and operation, promised to care for the Stones as she had cared for them. They kept that promise for 32 years. Gerhard and Martha Schmidt raised 3 children in that cabin, kept warm through harsh winters by the system. A Swedish widow had built before they were born. They expanded the woodpile, improved the flue seals, replaced boards as they wore. They understood what they had, and they valued it. But in 1923, they sold the property to a family from Chicago who'd made money in manufacturing and wanted a ranch in the romantic West. The new owners, the Hendersons, had grown up with coal furnaces and steam radiators. They'd never heated a home with wood, never understood the relationship between fuel and warmth that frontier life demanded. When they looked at the cabin's heating system, they saw complexity where the Schmidts had seen elegance. They saw labor where others had seen efficiency. By autumn of 1923, the floorboards over Sigrid's stone chamber had been nailed shut. A modern cast-iron stove occupied the corner where her original firebox had stood. The flue channels were blocked, sealed, forgotten. The Henderson family survived 2 winters before deciding that ranch life wasn't for them after all. They sold the property in 1925 and returned to Chicago, where warmth came from radiators fed by basement boilers. And no one had to think about thermal mass or granite chambers, or the ancient wisdom of storing heat in stone. The cabin passed through 3 more owners over the next 90 years. Each one made modifications. Each one moved further from the original design. The stone chamber remained beneath the floor, but no one knew it was there. No one felt the warmth that still radiated faintly upward from granite that had been heated by Sigrid Halvorson's fires half a century earlier. The Stones remembered, but there was no one left to ask them what they knew. Sigrid died in Helena on March 15, 1908. She was 72 years old. Her obituary in the Helena Independent ran to 4 sentences: longtime resident, widow of pioneer Gunnar Halvorson, survived by various nieces and nephews. Services to be held at First Lutheran Church. No mention of heating systems. No mention of stone chambers or thermal mass or the winter she'd kept 13 people alive when a storm tried to kill them all. No mention of the knowledge she'd carried from Sweden and planted in Montana, soil knowledge that had spread through a valley and saved lives that winter had intended to claim. She was buried beside Gunnar in the Stillwater Creek Cemetery, the grave she'd stood over 41 years earlier when everything seemed lost. Her headstone was simple granite, the same type of stone she'd used to build her system, inscribed with only her name and dates. The people who'd known her told stories at the funeral. Josiah Kincaid's grandson, now a grown man with children of his own, spoke about the blizzard of 1877 and the warm cabin that had saved his grandmother's life. Captain Rourke's nephew described the technical brilliance of her design, the mathematical elegance that his uncle had spent years trying to improve upon. Henry Sutter, 43 years old and the most successful builder in western Montana, stood at the graveside and remembered a warm floor beneath his fever-racked body, remembered breathing easier as heat rose through boards above 4 tons of granite, remembered a woman's voice telling his mother that the stones would remember. He didn't speak at the service. Some things were too important for words. Stories like secrets don't make history books. They live in family memory, passed from grandparents to grandchildren around dinner tables and beside deathbeds. They grow softer with each telling losing details, gaining legend, transforming from specific events into general wisdom. The Swedish widow who built the heated floor becomes the immigrant woman who knew something about construction. The blizzard of 1877 becomes a hard winter, then a cold spell, then simply the old days when life was difficult. The names fade first, then the dates, then the technical details until all that remains is a vague sense that someone somewhere once knew something worth knowing. That's how knowledge gets lost. Not dramatically, not in fires or floods, just gradually as people forget that anyone ever knew. By 1950, no one in Stillwater Creek remembered Sigrid Halverson's name. The heated cabins she'd inspired had been demolished or converted or abandoned. The thermal mass systems had been replaced by propane furnaces and electric baseboards. The principle that had saved lives was buried under layers of technological progress that made efficiency unnecessary. Coal was cheap. Oil was cheaper. Why store heat in stone when you could burn fuel continuously and never think about it? The answer, of course, was that you couldn't burn fuel continuously forever. Eventually, the easy sources ran out. Eventually, the prices rose. Eventually, people started asking whether there was a better way. But by then, the knowledge had been lost for generations. The people who might have remembered were dead. The books that might have preserved it were moldering in obscure archives. The stones that held the truth were buried beneath floorboards that no one had lifted in decades. Until 2019. Rachel and David Morrison found the listing on a Montana Land Trust website. Historic homestead property, the description read, original 1870s cabin with various modifications. Ideal for restoration project. They were historians, both of them. Rachel specialized in frontier architecture at the University of Washington. David worked as a preservation consultant helping property owners restore historic structures to their original configurations. They'd spent their careers studying how people had lived before electricity and central heating before industrial convenience made survival easy. The Stillwater Creek property called to them in ways neither could fully explain. They closed on the cabin in April and moved in for the summer planning to document the structure before beginning restoration work. The modifications were extensive. 20th century owners had added rooms, replaced windows, installed modern heating systems that looked painfully out of place against the original log walls. But beneath the changes, the bones of something older remained. It was Rachel who noticed it first. She was crawling through the cramped space beneath an addition, mapping the original foundation when she placed her hand on the floor above her and felt warmth. Not dramatic warmth, not the heat of a functioning system, just a temperature differential, subtle but unmistakable. The floor was warmer than it should have been, warmer than the surrounding structure, warmer than the May air outside. She mentioned it to David that evening and he dismissed it as imagination. Thermal variations in old buildings were common. Sunlight through windows, residual heat from cooking, a dozen explanations that didn't require anything unusual. But Rachel couldn't let it go. She returned the next day with instruments: a thermal imaging camera borrowed from a colleague, a surface temperature probe, a moisture meter to check for the hot water pipes that sometimes explained anomalous readings. There were no pipes, no heating elements, no obvious source for the warmth that showed clearly on her thermal camera. A rectangular section of floor approximately 12 feet by 8 feet that consistently registered 4 degrees warmer than the surrounding boards. She pulled up one of the floorboards and found the stones. The chamber was exactly as Sigrid Halvorsen had built it 142 years earlier. 7 feet deep, 12 feet long, 8 feet wide. Lined with river granite mortared together with clay that had cracked in places but still held. The flue channels were blocked with debris collapsed in sections, but the basic structure remained intact. 4 tons of stone sitting silently in the darkness, still holding a trace of warmth from fires that had burned before either of Rachel's grandparents were born. She sat on the edge of the excavation for a long time, staring down at the granite in the beam of her flashlight. "Someone built this," she said when David joined her. Someone understood thermal mass heating well enough to construct a functional system in the 1870s. "The principle isn't new," David said. "Romans, Koreans, Northern Europeans. But here, in Montana Territory." During the homestead era, he knelt beside her and studied the stonework. The craftsmanship was evident even after more than a century of neglect. The stones fitted together precisely sized and shaped to create a continuous thermal mass. The channels, though, blocked, followed logical paths designed to maximize heat transfer. "This wasn't amateur work," he said. "This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing." They spent the rest of the summer researching. Rachel tracked down land records that showed the property's ownership history. Gunnar and Sigrid Halvorsen, original homesteaders, 1872. Various transfers through the following decades. The Schmidts from 1891 to 1923. The Hendersons briefly. Others after that. David found Henry Porter's report in the Territorial Archives in Helena buried in a file cabinet that hadn't been opened in decades. 23 pages of detailed documentation, including diagrams that matched almost exactly what they'd found beneath their floor. The report mentioned Sigrid Halvorsen by name, described her as the originator of the system, noted her background in Sweden, her grandfather's knowledge, her determination to build something that everyone said couldn't work. They found more. Church records that showed Sigrid's membership in the Helena Lutheran congregation, a brief mention in a local newspaper from 1879, a human interest story about unusual construction methods in frontier settlements, the obituaries of people who'd been saved during the blizzard of 1877. Their families scattered now across the country but traceable through genealogical databases. Rachel contacted descendants, grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the Sutters, the Kincaids, the Rourkes. Some of them had heard family stories about a terrible storm and a warm cabin. Some of them had vague memories of grandparents mentioning heated floors and Swedish immigrants. None of them knew the details anymore. But when Rachel told them about the stone chamber, about the system she'd found beneath her floor, something sparked in their eyes. Recognition, connection, the sense of touching something that had been lost and was now found. "My grandmother used to talk about the warm floor," one elderly woman said during a phone interview. I thought she was confused, mixing up memories. But she always said the floor was warm, and the Swedish lady saved her father's life. Her father was Henry Sutter, the 4-year-old boy whose lungs had filled with cold, whose lips had turned blue, whose breathing had eased only when he lay on boards above 4 tons of heated granite. Rachel wrote her thesis about thermal mass heating systems in frontier Montana. Using the Halverson cabin as her primary case study, she documented everything she'd found: the construction methods, the historical context, the spread of the knowledge through the valley and its eventual disappearance. She traced the system's origins back through Sigrid's family to Uppsala, Sweden, and beyond that to the centuries-old traditions of Northern European heating. She connected it to Korean ondal systems and Roman hypocausts, showing how different cultures on different continents had independently discovered the same fundamental truth. Stone remembers heat. Air forgets it instantly. The thesis was published in 2021 by the University of Montana Press. It sold modestly as academic publications do, finding its audience among historians and architects, and the small community of people interested in traditional building methods. But the real legacy wasn't the book. Rachel and David restored Sigrid's system. They cleared the blocked flue channels. They repaired the clay mortar. They replaced the damaged floorboards with period-appropriate lumber milled from salvaged barnwood. On the 1st of December 2021, 144 years after Sigrid Halverson had first charged her stone chamber, Rachel built a fire in the restored firebox. The system worked. Not perfectly. Not with the efficiency it had shown in its original configuration. Time and neglect had taken their toll, but the fundamental principle remained sound. Heat traveled through the flue channels, entered the stone mass accumulated in the granite over hours of burning. By the following morning, the floor was warm. They host visitors now, history enthusiasts and architecture students, sustainability advocates interested in passive heating methods, elderly descendants of the Stillwater Creek settlers who want to see what their great-great-grandparents experienced during the worst winter anyone could remember. The cabin has become a small museum, a working demonstration of knowledge that was nearly lost. Rachel gives tours on weekends during the summer months, explaining the science behind the system, telling the story of the Swedish widow who built it. Some visitors are skeptical. They've grown up with central heating and insulated walls with thermostats and fossil fuels. The idea that stones can remember heat sounds like poetry rather than physics. Then they feel the floor beneath their feet. They place their palms against boards that radiate gentle warmth without any visible source. They experience what 13 people experienced during 3 desperate days in December 1877, and they begin to understand. 5 thermal mass systems still exist in various states of preservation along Stillwater Creek. None besides the Halverson cabin are functional. The others were abandoned decades ago, their chambers filled with debris. Their flue channels collapsed, their stones cold and silent. But they're there, beneath floorboards and foundation rubble, beneath layers of modification and neglect. Evidence of a time when survival demanded innovation. When different cultures brought different solutions to identical problems, when a 41-year-old widow could prove an entire community wrong through nothing more than patience, labor, and knowledge carried from another world. The frontier wasn't romantic. It was hard and cold and killed people who made mistakes. A bad decision in November meant a frozen corpse in March. There were no second chances, no safety nets, no technological conveniences to compensate for poor planning. But it was also a laboratory, a testing ground where necessity forced creativity and diverse populations shared what they knew. Swedish thermal mass, German root cellars, Norwegian sod construction, Chinese irrigation techniques. Every wave of settlers brought wisdom from somewhere else, and the smart ones understood that American methods weren't the only methods, that survival sometimes meant learning from people who'd faced similar challenges for centuries. Sigrid Halvorsen knew that heat radiates in all directions. That stone holds warmth while air releases it. That solutions proven over generations deserve respect, even when they seem strange to eyes that have never seen them. She knew it because her grandfather knew it, because Uppsala winters had taught her family truths that Montana winters would confirm, because knowledge passed down through generations carries the weight of countless tests, countless failures, countless refinements that no single lifetime could achieve. She proved it alone in a cabin on the Montana frontier while her neighbors laughed and predicted her death. She proved it again during 3 days of storm, when her cabin became the only warm place for miles and 13 people crowded inside to survive. She proved it every winter for 14 years, burning half the wood her neighbors burned while sleeping warmer than any of them. And now, more than a century later, the stones still prove it every time someone rebuilds the fire and waits for warmth to rise through the floor. The last visitors of the season leave the Halvorsen cabin as autumn shadows lengthen across Stillwater Creek. Rachel banks the fire and closes the flue dampers, preparing the system for winter rest. David is documenting repairs they'll need to make in the spring, the endless maintenance that historic preservation demands. The temperature outside has dropped to 43 degrees. Inside, the floor is warm. Rachel places her palm against the boards and closes her eyes. She imagines Sigrid standing here in November of 1877. Clay on her hands, exhaustion in her bones, the absolute certainty in her eyes that everyone who doubted her was wrong. She imagines Henry Sutter at 4 years old, fever-racked and struggling to breathe, placed on a bed above heated stones that saved his life. She imagines Josiah Kincaid, the loudest skeptic, sitting on this floor and weeping because he'd never felt anything like it, because everything he thought he knew about heating and survival had just been proven false. She imagines generations of families warming themselves by stones they didn't understand, benefiting from knowledge they'd never learned, taking for granted what had once been revolutionary. And she imagines Sigrid at the end, 72 years old, in a Helena boarding house remembered by no one outside her immediate family. Her great achievement reduced to 4 sentences in a newspaper obituary. The stones remember, Rachel says quietly to the empty cabin, even when everyone else forgets. Outside, the sun sets behind the western ridge. The temperature continues to drop. Winter is coming to Stillwater Creek as it has come every year for millennia, as it will continue to come long after everyone reading these words is gone. But in one small cabin, the floor is warm. The stones hold their heat, and the knowledge that Sigrid Halvorsen carried from Sweden to Montana, that she proved against all doubt during the worst storm in 5 years, that she shared freely with anyone willing to learn that knowledge lives on. Not in history books or government reports, not in academic papers or museum exhibits, in granite, in warmth, in the simple truth that some things once learned don't have to be forgotten. Stone remembers heat, And sometimes when the right person asks the right questions, the stone remembers everything.